All right, everyone. Welcome to Smart Health Talk Radio Show. I'm your host, Elaine McFadden. I'm a dietitian with a master's in public health. And we have this show right here on KCA because we care about your health. And we have a very special guest for you today who's going to help give you some information that will hopefully help you make better decisions on what kind of foods that you eat, what kind of things that you choose to do around your house as far as dealing with bugs, in your home, in your garden, that kind of a thing. So many people choose pesticides. They think it's safe because they see it on a store shelf. But after what you hear today, I'm hoping that you're going to think twice about that. And I want you to even think about doing more research on your own. Our guest today has quite a story to tell. Very qualified person, and I'm just going to let him go ahead and introduce himself and tell you a little bit about who he is and his credentials and where he got to the place where he was actually researching the number 2 most used pesticide in the country, Atrazine. So, Dr. Tyrone Hayes, graduate from Harvard and Berkeley, welcome so much to our show, Smart Health Talk. Go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Well, wow. My birthday's on Friday. I turned 49. So I'm going to try to sum up 49 years in 5 minutes.
Woo! 49. Yay!
So I was born in South Carolina 49 years ago Friday, and grew up there in an area that was sort of swampland with snakes and turtles and frogs and birds, and just fell in love with biology, was encouraged not to bring animals into my house, but encouraged by my parents to continue to learn and to explore, and especially my grandmother as well, my mother's side. Went through high school, was always interested in science, ended up going to Harvard and majoring in biology and studying frogs and frog development and reproduction. And by the time I was done there, realized I wanted to go further and came to UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, for a PhD, and was hired right out of my PhD, and I've went from assistant to associate to full professor here at Berkeley. So my whole career has been here at Berkeley. Early in my career, my interests have always been in studying development and amphibian development, how environmental factors regulated development and reproduction and physiology and behavior, and literally goes back to when I was a kid, wondering things like, simple questions like, how do birds know when to fly south? Or how do they know when to build a nest? Or how do tadpoles know when to metamorphose? So what are those environmental cues that help an animal determine when and where is a good time to do something in development or physiology? And in college, I kind of learned that hormones were kind of the signals that translated, for example, a change in day length or temperature to a change in an animal's physiology. And by the time I was finishing graduate school, started to realize that there were a lot of chemicals in interfere with those signals. So that an animal's trying to determine when to become a male, or if I should become a male or a female, or should I build my nest and breed now, or should I metamorphose now? There were chemicals that can interfere with those decisions, so-called endocrine disruptors. And I was approached very early in my career, before I had tenure, by a company. They were then Novartis, and they produced this chemical called Atrazine. And they asked me to use my experiments in my lab to try to understand whether or not Atrazine was an endocrine disruptor. And it turned out it is probably one of the most potent endocrine disruptors known. The EPA just announced that it's harmful to aquatic life and terrestrial life. It's about to come out with a ruling on its effects on humans. And the state of California just declared and recognized that atrazine is a reproductive toxin. Things that I could have told them 20 years ago, but now they're listening now. They're reading the data. Atrazine acts on the reproductive development and function. It decreases testosterone, the male hormone. So exposed males are demasculinized. They can't make sperm, or they don't make a sperm. They don't show reproductive.
So atrazine is like something that's found in water more than any other pesticide. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, it's the most commonly detected pesticide in rainwater, groundwater, drinking water, you name it.
How come atrazine is found in water more than any other pesticide?
There are a
Do
couple of
you,
reasons. One, we use so much of it. It's the second most widely used pesticide, second only to glyphosate or Roundup. And two, it's very highly water soluble. And it's also very persistent, so it doesn't degrade very readily, depending on the environmental circumstances. It doesn't very readily degrade, so it can around. The last time I saw talk in France, it had been banned for a decade, and it was still around in the aquifers, even though they weren't using it there.
and
It
yeah, I saw this one really shocking statistic that it was like here that some farmers could actually use levels that were 200 million times higher than we're using in the laboratory. Is
that's
that
probably
sound right?
not. I don't have the data in front of me, but I think the number is 240 million times that, and that is the application rate, the range that's recommended for atrazine use can be up to 240 million times what we're using in the laboratory, because we get effects at well, depending on the effect, we get some effects at zero point 0.1 parts per billion, and the recommended application rate goes up to 240 parts per billion, I believe. So, yeah.
Well, the thing is that another problem that I see a lot in how people are perceiving things is they think just because they see something on the shelf in the store that it's safe. Because they say, oh, well, if they wouldn't be selling it if it wasn't safe. What do you say to people that have that perception?
Um, no. I say no because I think on the most conservative point of view is a pesticide or a biocide is something that's designed to kill something, and so you have to. So it can't be safe. It's like saying that guns are safe. You can use guns safely, right? And certainly you can use pesticides in more safe manners. But anything that's designed to kill something will kill something, and will also have unwanted side effects. There's no delivery method or pesticide I know of that will only go to the target. And because we share common evolutionary history, whatever the target is, there's some other organism that will also be affected by that pesticide, by that methodology. The other problem with that methodology is we're just now, in the last 20 years, discovering a lot of things that are we know now to be very important. So many of the chemicals that we're using now won't kill you. You can eat, won't kill you acutely or directly. So you can sit there now and eat or drink atrazine if you want. You're not going to drop dead anytime soon. But if you're exposed to chronic low levels of atrazine and many of these other chemicals, of these other pesticides, then the cumulative effects, things like your likelihood of developing breast cancer, or things like your likelihood of losing reproductive fitness, of having your sperm count go down, those kinds of things are what we're worried about. Exposure in utero. So many of the chemicals that might not affect an adult, or maybe even might not have a big effect on a child, if you're exposed when you're developing, and all of your tissues and cells are deciding where to go and how to behave after exposed to these kind of chemicals, could be very bad. We're just now starting to scratch the surface with regards to what's now called epigenetic effects. And these are effects where the adult might be exposed to a chemical, and you might not show an adverse effect, but then that exposure will be reflected in some adverse developmental effect in the next generation, even though they aren't exposed directly. Because some of these chemicals can not cause mutations, but change the way that genes are expressed, and that can inherit it in your germline, in your sperm or in your eggs that you pass on to the next generation. We're just starting now to scratch the surface on those kinds of alternatively, however, there are effects on females, like, for example, mammary tumors are increased with atrazine in rats, and there's at least one study that associates mammary tumors with atrazine exposure in human females, because mammary tumors or breast cancer is estrogen dependent, and also the birth defects and the problems with carrying the baby to term. Atrazine induces abortions, for example. That's been shown by the EPA, by
Wow.
EPA stories.
That's heavy duty. And now you mentioned mammary tumors in females, but is there another level of damage that's done from atrazine that prevents a woman from being able to feed her baby,
Yes.
take care of her baby?
Yes. So the mammary tumor data are from adult females that are exposed. there's a series of studies done by the Environmental Protection Agency labs that are published that show that if a female is exposed in the womb, she will be born with very poor mammary or very poor breast development and then unable to feed her offspring. So you end up seeing an effect, retarded growth and development in a baby, a female baby, or a baby period, because of the grandmother's exposure to atrazine. So it's going down
Really? Wow.
generation.
Wow. Because I know that I did have Dr. Michael Hansen, senior scientist at Consumer Reports, on the show, and he said that, and I'm thinking that he might have been referring to your research when he said it. He said that in 3 generations, there's a good chance that a high percentage of the population will be sterile.
Well, the atrazine is playing a role in that. There's studies in rats showing that these atrazine effects can affect the germline, in other words, affect the sperm, so that when the exposed rats reproduce, they're passing down alterations in how genes are expressed, et cetera, to the next generation. And nobody knows how many generations could be affected, as these so-called epigenetic effects are passed on from generation to generation to generation, including generations that aren't exposed directly. Now, compound that with the fact that not only are you passing down these adverse effects, but then the next generation is also, in addition, being exposed again. So what that says is that best case scenario, we get rid of atrazine now, still be looking at multiple generations of exposure. Worst case scenario is we keep using atrazine, and not only are you passing down the effects, but we're getting exposed over and over and over and over.
So we're compounding those effects, and we have no idea what that could be. And so there's it also affects your immune system. How does that? Because I'm really big on the immune system.
Yeah.
I want mine strong for one thing, because I don't want to be dependent on antibiotics. And I thought it was interesting. I got like super sick from some lung thing back in March. I chose to not use antibiotics. It was probably a virus anyway, but I know a lot of people that were taking antibiotics that had actually given it to me. And I got well in 3 weeks, and I found out that a family member's doctor got what I think was probably around the same thing. It took him 6 weeks to get well.
Yeah.
I was using a lot of things like probiotics, drinking kombucha, and that kind of thing, and good broths, chicken broths with bone broth, that kind of a thing. How is this affecting the immune system? Because to me, that is just huge, especially if if you're that weak that you're continually getting sick, or you're more susceptible to some of our top killing diseases.
Yeah.
In what way is that working?
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of studies that have looked directly at atrazine and immune function. Studies in frogs, salamanders, and studies in rats. And those studies show that atrazine does cause a decrease in immune function. And one of the proposed mechanisms is that it upregulates the stress hormone, cortisol or corticosterone, and that stress hormone can knock down your immune system. We've published some work showing that atrazine, along with other pesticides as well, can cause immune disruption, and we believe that mechanism is also upregulating the stress hormone, which then downregulates your immune system or immune function.
Yeah, I have heard of research that the fight or flight mechanism that we have to deal if someone's attacking us, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, people are in that mode a lot during the day nowadays, but that actually lowers your white cell count because of having those fight or flight hormones in your bloodstream over an extended period of time. That your white blood cell count will go down, which does leave your body more open to being infected.
Yeah, and we've shown some of that in the laboratory, especially with pesticide mixtures. But again, people have shown similar things with rats and amphibians with atrazine alone.
Now, I'd like to kind of go back to when Novartis first approached you. And I know that word because as a dietitian, they made a lot of products that were given as tube feedings, that kind of thing in the hospital. And I had a friend that I think not a friend, but a fellow classmate that went and worked for that company to go sell their products, something I would never choose to do. But, they came to you to do this research, and you started doing the research, and there was things that you did along the way where you actually even diluted the water that you were exposing them to, like you said, at levels like way lower than was being used in the field. And then you got these results, and then they weren't too happy with those results. And I think, first of all, when I first heard the stories, I just thought, wow, that's one really brave person, because even like doing my show, I kind of wonder. But the nothing like what you went through, and I just can't even imagine that. But if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some of what happened, because I think people think, again, it comes back to, just because that product is sitting on the shelf does not mean that it's safe, because you're not realizing everything that what happened behind the scenes to get that product to the shelf.
Yeah.
And I did read, too, something that the CEO of Syngenta was actually hired by the federal government at one point. I was kind of wondering, I don't know if you heard about that, but I was wondering if that had anything to do with it getting approved for use in the United States. But why don't you just go ahead and tell us, like, kind of a summary of what that experience was, and then what happened once you gave them the results.
Well, actually, you said something interesting in that we're not talking about drugs. Remember, we're talking about pesticides, and the governing body that regulates pesticides is the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency didn't come into existence until 1972. So most, if not all, of the pesticides you see on the shelf were never approved and never went through testing. There was no governing body. I mean, I believe the USDA was challenged before 1972, but chemicals like atrazine came on the market in 1958. So there was no testing and approval. So the EP.
Oh, wow, 1958.
1958. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Chemicals like DDT and 2,4-D, these all came about in the 1940s. So there was no approval. They were used during wartime, and then they just were brought and used in agriculture. So there was no approval. So the EPA's job now is to find bad ones and get them off the market. So just because it's on the shelf doesn't mean that it went through any testing at all. It's retroactively going through testing after, how many years of being on the market and how many millions and millions of pounds per year.
Does the FDA actually test products themselves?
No, not pesticides are regulated by Environmental Protection Agency, not the FDA.
Oh, excuse me, the Environmental Protection Agency. Do they test?
No, the testing is up to the company.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Fox Garden, the hen house, because the EPA's position. I've talked to people in the EPA about this, and I was told our position is the company that makes the money should pay for the testing, not the taxpayer. So it's up to the company, which sounds like a good idea, but then it's up to the company to show that their product is bad. So Novartis, they were Novartis back then, hired me to study whether or not atrazine was an endocrine disruptor. And at the time, they had a scientific advisory panel that was being run by a guy, I'll say his name, Ron Kendall. And at the exact same time, Ron Kendall was also sitting on the scientific advisory panel for the EPA. So he was working for the company and making money for the company and organizing experiments for the company while he was sitting on the US EPA board reviewing the same work. And he was also editing a major journal. So he was also controlling what got published in the field and what didn't get published. Same guy. Same guy. And when I found, the negative results, they weren't happy. They I'll just say it, they tried to get me to manipulate data in inappropriate ways. They tried to I'd signed a contract. They put a gag order. I couldn't talk to other scientists. I couldn't, go to conferences and talk about the work. I couldn't discuss it outside of our meetings with them. And they were controlling the funding as to whether or not I did the follow-up experiments and what I did. And essentially, I walked out of the contract. I used my own funding, and my students and I worked on our own to get the work done and to get the work published and out into the scientific literature and to be reviewed. And the company then hired other scientists to refute my work. And then they set out on a campaign to personally and professionally discredit me and try to ruin my career. And they argued that they didn't for a long time until they lost a court case recently. And New Yorker Magazine wrote about it. They had handwritten notes. They had many, many meetings where they wrote down For example, under their scientific agenda, their first line in their own handwriting was discredit Hayes. And it
Wow.
went beyond the science. They had lists of things that they were going to do to me, like exploiting my father's health problems, like investigating my wife, investigating my students, purchasing my name on the internet and redirecting all searches to them. They had access. One guy announced he had access to my email and that they were reading my emails, and they were following me around. They were, and one particular employee would follow me to certain meetings and threaten me with violence, with sexual violence against me and my wife and my daughter. And I've gotten strongly written letters from their lawyer, but he knows that it's true, and he knows that there is evidence and proof of it. So,
Gosh, I don't know how you could keep it together. I would just be like, I would think I would want to blow up at the person, but you were pretty smart. Actually, you kind of did some, kind of like some little spy James Bond kind of moves as well, right? Because they hacked your email?
yeah.
Wow, God, that must have been just so creepy, and these people showing up at these conferences before you got your little system down, showing up at the conferences and threatening you at the conferences.
Well, I mean, the most difficult thing was it was stuff that I knew, but that until now I couldn't talk about because then I would just look crazy. I said, "Follow me around," and but they wrote it all down. They very carefully documented their plans to, even the following me around. They very carefully wrote out a plan and documented that they were going to go everywhere I was, and they knew where I was at all times, and they were going to send out pamphlets. And I see now, even now, there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of these things. I was just looking at some of the notes the other day where they, what they document, where they were writing statements for people inside the EPA. So the statement that, Ann Lindsay of the EPA made the statement that I never gave the EPA my raw data. And I have all these notes and all these emails from the EPA thanking me for my raw data. I'm like, why would she say that? And then you look through Syngenta's notes, and they have notes like, did we give Ann Lindsay her statement yet? Is she ready to talk to the press? So they were actually directing what the EPA said. They were actually putting lies in the EPA's mouth as part of their campaign to discredit me. And they wrote it down. And then they took it to a judge with a big stamp on it that says privileged and confidential. I'm like,
but good for you. Good for you. Well, I just think that is as hard as it was for you to have to go through that. I mean, I'd like to see something good come out of it, in that it's an eye opener for people that things are not just black and white and cut and dry here. And we're talking big money.
yeah.
Like, how much money do these people make off these pesticides? It's like even billions of dollars, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, this is their number one selling product for what was the largest chemical company in the world.
Wow, because Syngenta, we were watching the Tour de France, and as they're going through Switzerland at one point, people have this view of Switzerland as, this kind of a purity about them, and yet they're the home of Syngenta.
Yeah.
And so, you can't just assume that these people are not using these products, that farmers are not using these products, because they're using them on different kinds of crops. And I guess corn is like the biggest. But one of the things that surprised me, but it didn't surprise me, was the golf courses.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually went to a golf course conference, and I could not believe the presence of the pesticide companies at this golf course conference. I mean, huge, giant displays and vehicles inside the building, and that was an eye-opener for me on just how connected golf courses are, because I love to golf, but I don't want to be out there being exposed to this. And even I've met with the Loma Linda University in their medical center, and they were spraying Roundup and other pesticides around the hospital. I mean,
Yeah.
what should we be thinking about this? Because I'm just thinking about the faces of those children that were fighting cancer and fighting for their life in the hospital, and coming outside and being exposed to these pesticides. It just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll respond to actually several things you said. One is, we have this view of Switzerland, and then Syngenta's Novartis is based there. but atrazine's never been legal in Switzerland.
Really?
Yeah, they don't use it there. It's nothing to do with the European Union. It's never been legal there. So, they're protecting themselves. Number two, golf courses, the most concentrated heavy use of pesticides to take care of the green. I mean, incredible use of atrazine. I mean, many other pesticides as well. So not a very nice place to roll around in the grass, if you know what I mean.
And what about the soccer fields and places where we let our kids go and play?
Yeah, even on my own campus, a group of us have been trying to stop, the cracks in the sidewalk. They walk along and spray herbicides. And really, is that necessary? Or even, we were talking about the drought earlier, and I took a photograph when I came in yesterday with the water sprinklers watering wood chips and pavement. So here I am not growing my food because I'm trying to save water, and my campus has sprinklers that are spraying the sidewalk and wood chips. I mean, we have to do a little better.
And I know we can do that because one of our guests was Ask the Bug Man. And he's such a generous guy. He actually came out with a whole plan for schools to be pesticide free. And he was in charge of an entire city in Arizona, including 8 buildings, like senior centers, that kind of thing. He didn't use one drop of pesticide for that entire city. So I'm like, well, what did you do when you had weeds? He goes, I just went down to Walmart and bought some vinegar. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, so what I love about him is he shows that we can do this. Mm-hmm. You can have a city that's pesticide free, because people just think that that's an impossibility. And what scares me too is people buy these and they use them around their home, around their family, thinking that they're safe because they have to kill ants or some other bug in their garden, and they're spraying it all over, and their pets and their child are being exposed to this. And it really scares me on what can happen. Now there's other people. I know that there was a paper that was published that backed your conclusions. There was 22 other scientists that had the same conclusion. So you're not alone in this.
No, and I put that paper together. I was the lead author on that paper. I put that paper together in direct response to the manufacturer, who kept saying, "Oh, there's no problem with atrazine. There's only this one guy and frogs." And, they were trying to build me as the lone crazy guy who had something against atrazine. I said, no, there's labs all over the world. And so there were 22 of us, which is a small portion of the people who studied atrazine, from 12 different countries who had all come to the same conclusions. And we put that work together, and it was a very nice, it was a very nice piece to put together to show, and even for me to learn how widespread the effects were and how many people were actually studying atrazine. And I've, made a number of friends with a number of those colleagues, and, and have had invitations to Argentina and Croatia and Serbia and many of the places where those guys are working since then.
Oh, that's cool. Those are nice places to visit.
It brings people together, atrazine.
Well, and just to kind of sum up, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the misinformation that gets out there. And I know there was one organization mentioned, the American Council of Science and Health, and we have the genetic literacy, these other people out there that when you really start to dig, you find out that they are supported by big industry.
Yeah.
And how do people sort out, as just the average person out there? It's so hard for them to know what they're reading, if they should believe it, because for 35 years I've been telling people pesticides are bad, but and I kind of know how you feel a little bit, because back then, I was the crazy health nut. People are just like, yeah, right. And I'm like, seriously, this can't be good. But there's a lot, is there anything that people can look for to kind of know that maybe they shouldn't trust the source?
It's hard to say, and now, again, since this court case, literally the paychecks to these people were in Novartis's and Syngenta's records. So many of these people, Steve Malloy, the junk science, and the I forget now, this guy who writes for Forbes magazine, and many of these cases, Syngenta wrote these things and then paid somebody else to put their names on them, and that's clear in the documents. And it was actually also one of the most disappointing things to me is, I would sort of, I'd be willing to debate with these guys, and then I found out they didn't really even have an opinion. Somebody was just paying them to have an opinion. So it wasn't really even a debate. It wasn't even really an academic discussion. It was just somebody paying them to say something, and they didn't really believe it anyway. And so, one of the things that's frustrating to me is like this guy who writes for Forbes magazine. When people write about me or when I publish a paper, the fact checking's crazy. I have to go back and check the spelling of my own name. But these guys can print things that are just absolutely not true.
I am with you on that, Dr. Hayes. I have seen articles from Forbes, and I'm just like, who is running that magazine? Because I know for a fact, because I've interviewed, a lot of different scientists, because you guys are the rock stars to me. And I can't believe that people like literally, they make it a living trying to discredit some of our best scientists. And plus, they come back with these things like, they're like, everything is an absolute.
Yeah.
When science is something that, we're continually learning new things and we're progressing because the human body is so complicated, our environment and how everything interacts. There's no way we've just got this thing all figured out. And yet they'll say, well, yeah, but, he doesn't really, that's not like a for sure thing or something like that. But really, we're not, that isn't necessarily the goal of a scientist always. What do you consider like what your job is and what you're trying to accomplish here?
My job is to try to get to the truth, and that should be based on evidence. And in my case, it's based on controlled experimental evidence. Whereas these guys, clearly, if you look at Syngenta's notes, their main goal under the science was discredit Hayes. And you look at like some of these things in Forbes magazine where, they paint this picture of that I'm a high paid expert legal witness. So they're trying to paint it that I do this for money. It's absolutely, I've never, ever, a lawyer bought me lunch once. That's it. I've never been paid by any lawyer. I've never been an expert witness. So it's just something that's absolutely not based on fact. They generated, one of the things I was impressed with is they generated a Wikipedia page about me that made it look like it was, my autobiography or something. And the people who monitor Wikipedia went through, figured out who this guy was, figured out his links to Syngenta, and you can read through this in the history on the Wikipedia page, took out the inappropriate and the untrue things and said, if you do it again, you'll be banned from posting anything on Wikipedia. And I was so impressed because I didn't have the time to go through, but they went through and figured out what was fact and what was fiction, and that this guy was linked, traced him all the way back to his links to industry. And I just, and again, for me, I can't imagine that my academic freedom is so important to me and my integrity is so important to me that I can't imagine how these guys function and look themselves in the face.
Well, and universities too. We hear about universities getting, money from big corporate, and that influences how they conduct research and how they present their results. Because you can have results and present it one way and make it look like something totally different than what the real main objective was in the beginning. So have you had personal experience where you see that corporate money is having a big influence on universities and research?
It's both directly and indirectly. I can tell you, if you're perceived as somebody, it doesn't even matter if you're directly in a fight, but if you're perceived as somebody who would discourage corporate from coming on your campus, then you run a risk.
That's tough. That's tough to be a professor with integrity
and
in the midst of all that.
It can happen in very subtle ways. And subtle ways.
And so, how does this affect you personally and like the choices that you make at home with the kind of foods that you choose and how you live your life? I know you're a father too, and so how does that impact you? Because I think people should mirror how our scientists are thinking, because once you get that information, it does start to affect your decisions. At least I would hope it was, because that would show you have intelligence.
Yeah. Well, we definitely have and I want to say even before I got involved with the atrazine stuff, we avoided using, ant sprays I mean, we did when I was a kid growing up. And certainly I remember early in my marriage, my wife buying ant roast and me saying, no, we don't need to use that. We don't want to use that. And so even really before the atrazine thing, I made an effort to limit the use of certainly of pesticides in my home and in my yard. We've never used them in the yard. Like I said, we grew all of our own food up until about a year ago, almost literally all of our own vegetables until the drought. And now we're trying to work out how to best do that and conserve water and all those things. And not just because of the pesticide issue, but we've always tried our best to support local organic farmers and small farms. And we're in a position where we can do that in California that maybe everybody can't to the same extent that we do. But and certainly things like personal, mosquito spray and things like that. We never, one, because I work on frogs and that stuff kills frogs. So, it's a big adjustment for my students to go, yeah, we're going to be out at night in water and you can't wear bug spray.
Well, so how did you feel when recently atrazine was added to the Prop 65 list? And I was wondering, could you explain to people what Prop 65 and what you thought about that move by the state of California?
Well, I think adding it to the list means that it can lead to stricter regulations for how it's used and where it's used, and that's very important. And I also felt, it's a hard question. It's like when the New Yorker magazine came out and people said, well, how do you feel? Do you feel vindicated? And I said, well, I kind of feel like that guy you see on the news who's been in jail for 40 years for a crime. Like, yeah, I'm out now, but I've been in jail for 40 years.
I know what you're saying.
I read the EPA saying atrazine is harmful to aquatic life, and I see the Prop 65 ruling, and I kind of like, well, yeah, it's about time, but I told you that 20 years ago, And, it's hard to say, I mean, it's certainly 20 years ago, I didn't think this is what I would be doing. It certainly steered my research career. It steered me into a different realm with my students. Like most of the students that I would get to work in my laboratory were students who just loved amphibians and reptiles and being outside. And most of the students I get now are students who, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it's a different group of students who just love public health and they want to do something for the agricultural community. And so they're, that's a good thing. But it's turned my lab and my research life in a direction that I would not have predicted. But feeling like I can still be what I call a little boy who loves frogs and do something useful. Like right now, we're working in my hometown in South Carolina, where the place where I grew up, where the frogs and the snakes and things that's all gone. It's all been paved under, and really one of the last few remaining places is a national park there, Congaree Swamp. And we learned 2 years ago that Congaree Swamp is contaminated with, guess what?
Atrazine.
And ethinyl estradiol. And the whole article, though, talked about the risks to the weekend people who come there to canoe and what if they fall in the water. And I thought, one, the park's there to protect the wildlife, wasn't mentioned in the article. And two, the park is in the middle of, surrounded by low-income black communities, and the ethinyl estradiol is running off of their leaky septic tanks, and they're exposed every day, and you're worried about the recreational canoer that comes in on the weekends. So, I used to make, I sort of used to make a joke about taking the hood to Harvard. So now I feel like I can take Harvard back to the hood and trying to get back there now and trying to monitor and trying to model how this mixture of pesticides that I'm already studying are affecting the wildlife in the park, but also trying to bring some recognition to how the people that are living in those areas, this environmental justice, environmental racist issue, that they're exposed every day. The person who dumps over in the canoe, maybe they have to worry about E. coli or something, but they don't have to worry about the things of people living there. So it's not what I thought I would be doing, but I'm pretty satisfied with where I am now.
I'm just thinking, about how low-income people are the ones eating most of these foods, and they're coming from, and it's used in fast food as well. Where, when we trace it back, and sugarcane, it's used on sugarcane, and then sorghum, which actually I've kind of got interested in sorghum because it's a starch blocker, which I thought was kind of interesting. I was wondering if maybe you didn't gain as much weight when you eat sorghum. But, that I'm just wondering if, just kind of a little thing between us even, I'm just kind of wondering if there's some sort of connection there.
There's a field now developing of people who study things called obesogen. So not only might it be related to high fructose corn syrup, which is a concern, but there are also some chemicals that tend to increase obesity. So that's the concern in and of itself. And even without the issues around high fructose corn syrup, it's the increased availability of sugars and the ability to put things in the sugars. And you're right, it's not only the low income community that's more likely to eat those foods. My wife, Catherine Kim, actually studies, one of the things she studies is food deserts, where you have people who don't even have,
Yes.
grocery stores with. She had this photograph from a place she worked in, I won't say where the vegetable counter was filled with Snicker bars. There was no vegetables even in the vegetable bin, and even if they wanted to, don't have access nearby.
Yes.
I don't want to misquote, but the closest grocery store was 45 minutes away. This community that she was working in. So, but it's not only that if you're low income, you're more likely to eat that food or have poor quality food, but also the low income people and minorities are the ones who are working in and living in areas where they're exposed to the chemicals as well. For example, in agriculture in California, 90% of our workers are Hispanic. So they're being exposed to the chemicals directly. They're also in low-income communities. And even though they're growing food and working in agriculture, are less likely to have access to healthy organic foods.
And we know that they have higher rates of
High rates, many, many diseases and cancers and you name it. Yeah.
that's really sad. Well, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hayes. This has been such a great experience for me, and I learned a lot. And that's one of the reasons I like to have smart people like you on the show. I get to be maybe a little bit smarter in the process. But I just want to thank you for your courage and bravery and everything that you've done because I know you did it in your heart because you care about people, and you're a person that has ethics on what is right and what is not right, and you stick with your ethics. And that we don't see that as much as we need to be seeing that. It's like people have lost their ethics, they lie, all these other things. I'm kind of old school. I believe in telling the truth.
Yeah.
And sticking with what's right and not putting people purposely in the line of harm, where something could happen to them, because like you said, you may not get sick right away. It may take years, but I've saw people in the hospital with cancers and these different things, and it's just, I'll never forget the screams and the what it meant to actually have those diseases. And I thought, I wouldn't wish this on my enemy even. It's just not right, because we can prevent it, right?
Yeah.
What would you tell people to do in their own lives to protect themselves, and if they want to make a difference?
Okay, before I do that, let me clear up one thing, because
Sure.
I want to make some numbers clear, because somebody is always watching. So the package of atrazine recommends application at 2.9 to 29 million parts per billion.
Okay.
We get effects at 0.1 parts per billion, which means that the application rate can be 290 million times higher than we're using in the laboratory. So that's the statement. I didn't have the numbers in my head, but I just looked it up to make sure. In terms of what people can do, I think one, in their own personal lives, do the best you can to avoid using synthetic chemicals and pesticides in the home, in your personal use. Supporting local organic farms, very important, as much as you can. I think there's a value in growing whatever you can, even if it's a couple of pots of tomatoes on your porch, but just getting a better understanding of where your food comes from and what it means to actually grow food, I think, is incredibly important to understand the people that are actually growing your food. And I think also doing your best to stay informed and inform others, and taking advantage of, for what it's worth, the EPA, for example, has comment periods where anybody can write in and give their opinion. So making yourself informed and knowing about those decisions, voting for local and politicians that reflect these ideals, I think, is incredibly important. I don't know what else I can say.
No, those are great. That was an incredible list. I've had this show and great guests like you, and I feel like if we change one person's life out there, it's all worth it. So.
Well, that could be.
Well, you're awesome.